Welcome to Asian Ghost Story, where timeless legends and haunting tales come to life. Join us as we explore the eerie and the extraordinary from across the continent. In a small bustling town once called Kien Tuong, known for its artisanal craft, there was a famous tailoring shop run by a skilled seamstress named Mrs. Tuesday. Her shop was a haven for beautiful creations, attracting clients from across the region. Among her apprentices was Ut Lanh, a young woman from a poor family. She often wore patched, threadbare clothes, starkly contrasting with the elegant fabrics she handled daily. One day, as the women worked and chatted, Ut Lanh gazed longingly at a roll of shimmering blue silk. "I wish I could wear a dress made of this fabric, just once in my life," she murmured wistfully. Mrs. Tu, busy with her work, chuckled, "You're silly, Ut. If you want a dress, just pick a fabric. When I'm free, I'll sew you one. It's no big deal." Hearing this, Ut's face lit up. She carefully selected the vibrant blue silk, dreaming of the day she could wear something so beautiful. Yet, life had other plans. Shortly afterward, tragedy struck. Ut Lanh drowned while fishing on the river during a storm. Her death left the town in mourning, and Mrs. Tu, heartbroken over losing her young apprentice, took charge of her funeral. Life moved on, and the tailoring shop returned to its bustling routine. One day, a customer chose the same blue silk Ut Lanh had admired and requested a dress. Mrs. Tu, overwhelmed by her workload, didn't remember her promise to Ut and agreed to make the garment. That night, as the rain tapped against the windows, Mrs. Tu stayed late, working on the blue dress. The shop was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of her sewing machine. She felt an uneasy sensation, as though someone was watching her. She glanced at the mirror nearby but saw nothing. Shaking off the feeling, she continued working. Suddenly, the sewing machine stopped. Mrs. Tu's eyes widened as she saw Ut Lanh's reflection in the mirror. The young woman sat at another sewing machine, her hands moving fluidly, her face pale and lifeless. "Ut, is that you?" Mrs. Tu whispered, trembling. Ut Lanh's head turned slowly, her lifeless eyes meeting Mrs. Tu's gaze. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Why did you forget your promise?" Terrified, Mrs. Tu fled the shop, leaving the blue silk unfinished. The next day, she returned with the other workers to find the shop in disarray. Threads and fabric were scattered everywhere, and water pooled under the sewing machine where Ut Lanh had appeared. The haunting persisted. Over the next few nights, the sound of sewing machines echoed through the empty shop. Workers began reporting strange occurrences, scissors moving on their own, needles vanishing, and faint whispers calling Ut's name. Some claimed to see shadows darting across the room. The once thriving shop became a place of fear. Desperate, Mrs. Tu visited the town's oldest elder, a woman named Grandmother Lin, renowned for her knowledge of spiritual matters. "The spirit is restless because of an unfulfilled promise," Grandmother Lin explained. "Ut Lanh's longing for the dress binds her to this world." Grandmother Lin instructed Mrs. Tu to host a ceremony to honor Ut Lanh's memory. The entire town was invited to pay respects. Mrs. Tu worked tirelessly to recreate the blue dress Ut had dreamed of, sewing with trembling hands. She placed the finished dress on an altar, surrounded by incense and offerings of Ut's favorite foods. During the ceremony, as the incense smoke curled upward, a chilling breeze swept through the room. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the dress on the altar moved, as if someone had touched it. Gasps filled the room as the silhouette of a young woman appeared faintly in the smoke. "Aiti Rose Ut Lanh." "Thank you," the ghostly figure whispered, her voice soft yet echoing in the silence. Then, as quickly as she appeared, she vanished. The room was left in stunned silence, but a sense of peace settled over the shop. After the ceremony, the haunting stopped, and the tailoring shop regained its former glory. However, Mrs. Tu's nights remained restless. She began having dreams of Ut, reliving their last conversation. In one dream, Ut stood by the river, her blue dress shimmering in the moonlight. "There's more to this," she said cryptically. "Find the truth." Driven by these visions, Mrs. Tu delved into Ut Lanh's past. She discovered that Ut's family had been plagued by misfortune. Her parents had died mysteriously, leaving Ut to fend for herself. Rumors in the town suggested a curse linked to an ancient heirloom that Ut's family had owned, a delicate bracelet believed to bring misfortune to its bearer. Mrs. Tu tracked down the bracelet, now in the possession of a distant relative. Determined to end the curse, she consulted Grandmother Lin again. The bracelet must be destroyed in a sacred ritual, the elder advised. It's the only way to free Ut's spirit completely. The ritual was performed under a full moon at the riverbank where Ut had died. As the group began chanting the incantations, a chilling wind whipped through the trees, extinguishing their torches. Shadows seemed to gather at the edge of the firelight, and a disembodied voice whispered, "You will fail." Fear gripped the participants, but Mrs. Tu held her ground, her voice unwavering as she led the chant. Suddenly, the fire roared to life, revealing a grotesque figure emerging from the shadows. It was the vengeful spirit of the curse's creator, its hollow eyes fixed on the group. Mrs. Tu stood firm, her hands trembling but resolute, as she recited the final words of the ritual. The bracelet was placed in a ceremonial fire, its intricate designs glowing red before crumbling to ash. As the fire died down, a faint laughter echoed through the night, followed by a serene silence. From that day on, Mrs. Tu never saw Ut's spirit again. The shop flourished, and the town remembered Ut not as a ghost, but as a beloved soul whose dreams had finally been fulfilled. Years later, Mrs. Tu shared her story with her grandchildren. "Promises carry weight," she told them. And sometimes, fulfilling a promise is not just about keeping your word, it's about setting a soul free. However, years after the shop's peace had returned, strange occurrences began anew. This time, it wasn't Ut's spirit but another force entirely. New shadows danced across the walls, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the empty hallways of the shop. Mrs. Tu, now an older woman, couldn't shake the feeling that the past had come back to haunt her in a different form. A new apprentice, Mai, began to experience vivid nightmares. In one dream, she found herself trapped in a forest, pursued by an unseen figure. When Mai recounted her dream to Mrs. Tu, the older woman paled. The description matched the location where Ut's bracelet had been destroyed. Determined to uncover the truth, Mrs. Tu and Mai visited the site. As they dug into the soil where the ceremonial fire had burned, they uncovered charred remnants of the bracelet. Shockingly, it had reformed, its intricate designs glowing faintly in the moonlight. Grandmother Lin, now frail but still wise, revealed a chilling truth. The bracelet's curse wasn't entirely broken, she explained. It is tied to the land and the suffering of those who perished here. To truly end it, you must confront the one who originally created the curse. The journey to find the origin of the curse led Mrs. Tu and Mai to an abandoned temple deep in the forest. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and the temple's walls were covered in cryptic symbols. Inside, they found an ancient manuscript detailing a tragic love story that had ended in betrayal and revenge. The curse had been cast by a spurned lover who had vowed that no happiness would ever flourish where their heart had been broken. As Mrs. Tu and Mai performed a final ritual to break the curse, the temple began to tremble. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe, and a ghostly wail filled the chamber. Shadows surged forward, forming clawed hands that reached for the pair. Mai stumbled back, her voice quaking as she cried, "Mrs. Tu, we can't do this." Mrs. Tu grasped her apprentice's hand tightly. "We must. Together." The final words of the incantation caused the symbols on the walls to glow fiercely, and the spirit screamed, a sound of pure anguish, as it was drawn into a swirling vortex of light. Shadows rose from the ground, forming into a figure with hollow eyes and an anguished scream. The figure, the spirit of the spurned lover, lashed out, but Mrs. Tu held her ground, reciting the incantations grandmother Lin had taught her. With a final burst of light, the spirit dissipated, and the bracelet crumbled into fine ash that was carried away by the wind. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time in decades, the forest felt alive again. When they returned to the town, the shop thrived as never before, and Mai became a skilled seamstress under Mrs. Tu's guidance. The tale of the curse became a local legend, a reminder of the power of promises and the consequences of leaving them unfulfilled. As Mrs. Tu looked out at the bustling shop, she smiled, knowing that the spirits of the past had finally found peace. "Every stitch we make carries a story," she told Mai one day. "Let's make sure they're stories of hope and fulfillment." But as time passed, whispers of yet another mystery began to surface. Villagers started noticing unusual occurrences near the river, where Ut's spirit had been laid to rest. Lanterns left along the banks would extinguish on windless nights, and the sound of laughter, soft and melodic yet haunting, echoed through the reeds. People spoke of a shadowy figure drifting across the water, cloaked in mist. Mrs. Tu, now deeply attuned to the supernatural, decided to investigate these new happenings. Accompanied by Mai and a few brave villagers, she ventured to the river under a crescent moon. The group carried lanterns and offerings, hoping to appease whatever force lingered. As they approached the water, the temperature dropped sharply. A dense fog rolled in, and the laughter grew louder, surrounding them. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist. It was not Ut, but a young woman dressed in an ancient style, her face veiled. She held a lantern that glowed with an otherworldly light. "Who are you?" Mrs. Tu called out, her voice steady despite the chill that gripped her. The figure raised her veil, revealing a face both beautiful and sorrowful. "I am Enhung," she said, her voice like the rustling of leaves. "I once walked these banks, searching for my beloved. He promised to return, but he never did." Enhung explained that she had been betrayed by a lover who had drowned her to hide their affair. Her spirit had lingered, bound by the pain of her untimely death. "I am drawn to this place because of the peace you brought to Ut's soul," Enhung said, her eyes glistening. "But my pain remains, and it poisons the river." Mrs. Tu, moved by Enhung's tale, promised to help. She and my returned to Grandmother Lin, who suggested a ritual of release involving the planting of a willow tree, a symbol of sorrow and healing, on the riverbank. "The tree will absorb her grief," Lin explained, "but it must be nurtured with care." The villagers gathered for the planting ceremony. As the willow sapling took root, Enhung's spirit appeared once more, her form growing fainter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying on the breeze. "May this river flow with peace." From that day, the river became a place of solace rather than fear. The willow tree grew tall and strong, its branches dipping gracefully into the water. It became a symbol of the town's resilience and the enduring power of compassion. Mrs. Tu lived to see many more seasons. Her legacy carried on not just in the stitches of her garments, but in the hearts of those she had touched. And when she finally passed, it was said that the willow tree wept, its leaves shimmering with dew that glowed like lantern light in the moon's embrace. As the years rolled on, stories of the tailor shop and its connection to the supernatural spread far and wide, drawing visitors and curious travelers to Kien Tuong. Some came seeking Mrs. Tu's legendary designs, while others were drawn to the tales of spirits and curses that surrounded her legacy. Among them was a young historian named Bao, who was determined to unravel the deeper mysteries of the shop and its haunted past. Bao spent weeks interviewing villagers and poring over local records. He uncovered accounts of other supernatural occurrences linked to the tailoring shop, strange symbols etched into fabric scraps, customers who reported vivid dreams after wearing Mrs. Tu's garments, and whispers of a hidden room within the shop itself. Intrigued, Bao approached Mai, who had since taken over the shop, and asked for permission to explore its history. "There's something you should see," Mai said, leading Bao to a concealed door behind a tapestry. The door creaked open to reveal a small, dimly lit room filled with Mrs. Tu's unfinished projects. The air was thick with the scent of aged fabric and incense. In the center of the room was a single dress form draped in a half-completed garment made of iridescent fabric that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. This was her last project, Mai explained. She called it the Dress of Memories. She believed it would hold the essence of every soul she had ever touched through her work. Bao examined the garment closely, noting intricate embroidery that seemed to depict scenes from Mrs. Tu's life, the bustling shop, the riverbank ceremonies, and even glimpses of the spirits she had encountered. As he traced the threads, a faint warmth emanated from the fabric, and he felt a surge of emotions, joy, sorrow, hope, and loss, as if the memories themselves were reaching out to him. Mai hesitated before speaking. "There's one more thing." Mrs. Tu left a note hidden in this room. It's addressed to whoever continues her legacy. The note, written in Mrs. Tu's elegant script, read, "To the one who carries the thread of this story, remember that every stitch binds us to those who came before and those who will follow. In the fabric of life, there is no end, only continuations. The legacy of compassion and courage is yours to nurture. Even when the threads seem frayed, remember that hope can mend anything. To the one who carries the thread of this story, remember that every stitch binds us to those who came before and those who will follow. In the fabric of life, there is no end, only continuations. Protect this legacy, and may it guide you as it did me." Bao felt a profound connection to Mrs. Tu's words and vowed to preserve her story. He began documenting the history of the shop, weaving together the tales of the living and the dead into a narrative that celebrated the enduring power of craftsmanship and compassion. The book he eventually published became a bestseller, drawing even more attention to the shop and its extraordinary past. With each passing year, the legend of Mrs. Tu grew, and her legacy continued to inspire new generations of artisans and storytellers. The shop, now a cultural landmark, stood as a testament to the threads that connect us all, threads that shimmer with the light of countless memories and the enduring spirit of hope. But the story did not end there. New visitors began reporting an unusual phenomenon within the shop. The iridescent dress, still unfinished, seemed to emit faint whispers when touched. Some claimed they could hear Mrs. Tu's voice guiding their hands as they traced the embroidery. Others felt a deep sense of calm, as if the dress itself offered them solace for their own sorrows. Mai, who had grown older, decided to finish the dress. Gathering a group of skilled seamstresses, she embarked on completing Mrs. Tu's final project. As they worked, the shop was filled with an otherworldly glow, and the spirits of those whose lives had been touched by Mrs. Tu seemed to gather, their presence a gentle reminder of the interconnectedness of all things. When the dress was finally finished, it was displayed in the center of the shop, encased in a protective glass dome. People from around the world came to see it, each leaving with a piece of its story imprinted in their hearts. The dress became a symbol of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend time and space. In the years that followed, the tailoring shop evolved into a museum dedicated to the art of sewing and the legacy of Mrs. Tuesday. Yet, late at night, when the museum was quiet, some swore they could still hear the hum of a sewing machine and the soft, reassuring whispers of a seamstress who had never truly left. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the supernatural. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And here's a question for you. Do you believe in the unseen connections between souls? Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective. Your support helps us keep these stories alive for generations to come. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.